The night of the Hartwell Foundation Gala, the kind of event where the champagne costs more than most people's grocery bills for a month, was not the place anyone expected to remember a carpenter from Sudbury. The ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto had been rented for the occasion, its coffered ceilings hung with arrangements of white orchids that probably took someone 3 days to install. Round tables draped in ivory linen filled the floor, each one anchored by a centerpiece of polished walnut and brushed brass. Decorative tributes, the program explained, to the late Gerald Hartwell, who had made his first fortune in furniture manufacturing before pivoting into commercial real estate. His daughter, the current chair of the foundation and the youngest person ever to land on Canada's top 40 under 40 list twice, had insisted the gala honor her father's origins. Everyone agreed it was a lovely touch. Her name was Cassandra Hartwell, 38 years old. And she stood near the front of the room in a dress the color of midnight water. She had her father's directness and her mother's precision, and when she spoke to the assembled donors, architects, and civic leaders, the room quieted the way rooms do when someone has learned how to own silence. No one in that room had noticed the man standing near the service corridor. His name was Owen Marsh, 44 years old, a Finnish carpenter out of Sudbury, who had driven 4 hours that afternoon to deliver and install a custom display cabinet the foundation had commissioned for the evening, a piece meant to hold Gerald Hartwell's original woodworking tools, the ones he'd used before the money came. The cabinet had been designed by a Toronto firm and contracted out to Owen's shop because the lead time was tight and the original cabinet maker had backed out. Owen had taken the job because January was slow, and his daughter's school trip to Ottawa wasn't going to pay for itself. He had finished installing the piece at 5:30, before the guests arrived. He'd been told he could leave through the kitchen. He was pulling on his canvas jacket near the service door when one of the event staff, a young man with a clipboard, asked him to wait. There was a small adjustment needed, a drawer pull that had shifted in transit. Owen said he could fix it in 10 minutes. He set his jacket down on a chair beside the door and went back to work. That was how he ended up in the ballroom when the gala began. His daughter, Isla, 9 years old, and with the unshakable conviction of someone who has never once been told she can't come along, was sitting in the service corridor on an overturned milk crate, eating a granola bar and reading a paperback. She had been in the truck for the whole drive, and she had kept herself entertained. And now she was waiting for her father the way she always waited. Without complaint, without fidgeting, with a patience that people twice her age rarely managed. Owen worked quickly. He had the drawer pull reset and tested within 8 minutes. He was cleaning up his tools when he heard a voice carry across the room. "Is that the craftsman who built the cabinet?" He looked up. Cassandra Hartwell was standing 12 feet away, flanked by 2 men in suits and a woman with a tablet. She was looking at him with the expression of someone conducting a rapid assessment. "I built it, yes," Owen said. She moved closer. The 2 men moved with her, slightly behind, the way that people with significant power tend to travel. "The dovetail joints," she said. "They're hand-cut?" "They are. The firm told me they'd be machine-cut, that they'd replicate the look. They would have been with the original shop. I do them by hand. It's faster for me." She looked at the cabinet for a moment, then back at him. He was wearing a gray Henley and dark work pants and boots that had seen better years. And he did not look like anyone else in the room, and he seemed entirely unbothered by that fact. "You drove from Sudbury this afternoon." One of the men behind her, his name was Terence Vose, a commercial developer who had donated significantly to the foundation and had opinions about everything, made a quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "A day tripper," he said, to no one in particular. "Drove down, put together some furniture, now he gets to see how the other half lives." Owen didn't respond to that. He crouched down to zip his tool bag. Cassandra looked at Vaux with an expression that suggested she found him less interesting than she'd hoped. Then she looked back at Owen. "My father built his first display cabinet when he was 22, she said. "In a shop behind the house in Kapuskasing. He always said the quality of a craftsman showed in how they handled the inside corners, the places no one would ever see. That if a person cut corners where no one was looking, they'd cut corners everywhere. Owen had finished zipping the bag. He stood up. "Your inside corners are perfect," she said. "Even the ones hidden by the back panel." "I know," he said. It wasn't arrogance. It was just a statement of fact. Terence Vaux straightened slightly. He was the kind of man who responded poorly to other men not being diminished. Gerald Hartwell could do a hand-cut dovetail in his sleep. Vaux said, louder now, addressing the small audience that had drifted their way. A few donors, a couple of board members, people with nowhere better to stand. He was self-taught. Learned from books and trial and error before there were YouTube tutorials to hold your hand. He paused to let people appreciate the remark. A few people smiled. "But I suppose anyone can do decent work when there's a clear set of plans and a modern workshop." Owen picked up his tool bag. "The foundation has your father's original workbench in storage," Cassandra said. She had not looked away from Owen. "It was brought in for the exhibit, but we had to pull it. The finish was failing and no one could agree on how to restore it without doing more damage. 3 different restorers gave us 3 different answers." She paused. "It's a 1958 Ulmia German cabinet maker's bench. Hide glue construction, original hardware. The top has a crack running along the front vise that 2 of the 3 restorers said was structurally compromising." Owen said nothing. He was listening. "If you could repair that bench tonight," Cassandra said, and something shifted in her voice. Not unkind, but precise, almost clinical, as though she were proposing a business arrangement rather than issuing a challenge. "Store it to the point where it could hold its own weight and be displayed safely. I'll have the foundation commission your shop for the permanent installation. 12 pieces. Full rate." The room had gone quiet in the way ballrooms go quiet when something interesting is happening. Vaux spread his hands. "It's a trick question," he said. Not to Owen, but to the people around them. "Hide glue repairs need controlled humidity, proper clamping, at least overnight to set. There's no doing it in." He glanced at his watch. 2.5 hours. "It's not possible." "What's a contractor from Sudbury going to do?" said another voice, somewhere in the small crowd. Owen didn't look to see who. He thought about Isla, out in the corridor on the milk crate. He thought about the school trip, and about the way she'd asked about it. Not with pressure but with the careful casualness of a kid who had learned not to expect things. "Where's the bench?" he said. The bench was in a staging room off the main corridor, covered with a canvas tarp. When Owen pulled the tarp back, he stood for a moment and looked at it without touching anything. The Ulmia was beautiful even in its damage. The maple top had the amber depth that only comes from decades of use and care. And the original hardware, the twin screw vise on the left, the wagon vise on the right, was intact if stiff. The crack ran from the front edge of the top back about 14 inches, following the grain. It had been opened slightly, probably from years of seasonal movement, and someone had attempted to fill it at some point with the wrong product, something that had skinned over without bonding, and was now making the situation worse. Cassandra had followed him in, along with Vaux, and 4 or 5 others. A foundation staff member had been sent to find Owen's truck, to retrieve whatever materials he had with him. Owen crouched beside the bench and ran his finger along the crack without pressing. He could feel where the fill had failed. He pressed one palm flat on the maple top, testing flex. "The crack isn't structural," he said. "Someone scared you with that. The top's a slab glue up, 4 pieces. The crack's in one seam, not through the wood. It's a glue joint failure from the dry fill they used. The restorer said it would need a full top replacement," Cassandra said. "That restorer wanted to replace the top," Owen said. He stood up. Different thing. His tools and materials came in through a side door on a hand truck, carried by a young staff member who looked mildly bewildered. Owen's truck was a working truck. It carried what a working carpenter carried: hide glue crystals in a jar, a small electric glue pot he used for site repairs, clamps, 6 of them, a mix of F-clamps and deep-reach bar clamps, card scrapers, a small bottle of fish oil, a set of chisels he kept razor-sharp out of habit and mild stubbornness, He set the glue pot on a folding table someone produced and plugged it into a wall outlet. He poured a measure of crystals and added water from a bottle in his bag. While the glue bloomed, he cleaned the failed fill from the crack with a thin chisel, working slowly, with the grain. The room had gone quiet around him. People who had come to look drifted in and stayed. Isla appeared in the doorway. At some point her paperback tucked under her arm. She had followed the sound of activity, the way she always did. She found her father crouched beside the old bench and she sat down cross-legged against the wall near the door, watching. Vo had grown quieter since they'd entered the staging room. He was watching Owen work with an expression that had started as skepticism, and was now something more complicated. "The glue won't set in 2 hours," he said. But he said it without the earlier confidence. "It'll set enough," Owen said. He was testing the temperature of the glue pot, with his wrist, the old way. "This isn't a structural repair. It's a seam repair on a piece that's going to sit in a climate-controlled room and hold tools. It needs to look right, and it needs to hold its own weight. It doesn't need to survive a job site." He worked the crack open slightly with a thin card, just enough to clean it to bare wood. Then he applied the hide glue in a smooth, even line, working it into the grain with his fingertip. He drew the seam closed with 2 bar clamps set across the width of the top, snugging them hand-tight, then checked the alignment with a straight edge. The seam was almost invisible before the glue even dried. "Where did you learn hide glue work?" someone asked. A woman near the back. One of the board members, Owen thought. "My grandfather," Owen said. He was wiping excess glue from the seam with a damp rag. "I grew up in it." "Where?" "Outside of Timmins." He set down the rag. He restored antique furniture as a side business, sold it out of the barn. Didn't make much money. Made good things. Isla looked up from her paperback. Her father didn't often talk about the barn. Owen let the glue tack for 20 minutes, then checked the seam, then turned his attention to the original finish. The bench top had been waxed but not varnished, as most good working benches were, and the wax had clouded and lifted in places. He warmed it with his palm, and worked a thin coat of the fish oil into the wood with a rag, careful around the freshly clamped seam. The maple came back slowly, its grain sharpening as the oil-absorbed Vo had moved closer. He was watching Owen's hands. "You're not going to refinish the whole thing," he said. "No. It'll look patchy. It'll look honest," Owen said. He worked the oil into the area around the repaired seam, feathering it out toward the undamaged sections. The transition was subtle, not invisible, but intentional, the way a good repair on an old piece should look. Not an attempt to erase history, a repair that said, "And it was fixed, and the piece is still itself." Owen stood up and looked at the bench. The seam was closed. The finish was alive again in the areas he'd treated. The old hardware, which he'd cleaned lightly with a dry cloth, caught the light. The bench looked like what it was. An old working bench that had been used and maintained and cared for. Not a reproduction, not a showpiece, but a real thing. Cassandra stepped forward and set her palm flat on the top, the same way Owen had when he'd first assessed it. She pressed down. The bench didn't move. She ran her thumb along the repaired seam. "You can feel it," she said. "You're supposed to," Owen said. "It's a repair, not a forgery." She looked at the bench for a long moment, then she looked at Owen. The room was very quiet. Vo said nothing. Cassandra took a slow breath through her nose. "I owe you a commission discussion," she said. 12 pieces. Full rate. He began collecting his clamps. "You could stay," she said, "for the rest of the gala." "I can't," he said. "I have to get her home." He nodded toward the door, where Isla was now standing with her paperback closed in her hands, watching the adults. "School tomorrow." Cassandra looked at Isla. Isla looked back at her with the calm, direct gaze of a child who had been around working adults long enough to not be impressed by parties. "What's your name?" Cassandra asked. "Isla. Did you come all the way from Sudbury?" "We left at noon," Isla said. "Dad let me pick the music for the first hour. Then we had to turn it off because he needed to think about the cabinet joints." Something crossed Cassandra's face, not quite a smile, something quieter than that. "He always does that," Isla said, without complaint. "He gets a look and then we go quiet." Owen had loaded the clamps back into his bag. He handed Isla her coat from the corridor where she'd left it. She pushed her arms through the sleeves without looking. The practiced motion of a child who had done it 1,000 times in 100 different doorways. Cassandra followed them to the service corridor. Vo had stayed behind in the staging room looking at the bench. A few of the others had drifted back toward the ballroom. "The commission. I'll have my assistant send you the details on Monday," Cassandra said. "Can I ask?" "The inside corners on the cabinet. Were those in the plans?" Owen glanced back at her. "No." "Why did you do them then?" He thought about it for a moment. Not because the question was difficult, but because he wanted to give an honest answer. "My grandfather used to say that the places nobody sees are the most important," he said. "Because that's the only place you're working for yourself. There's no audience. It's just you and the wood." He paused. He didn't make much money. But he never made a bad piece. Cassandra looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. "My father said almost the exact same thing," she said, 30 years ago in a shop in Kapuskasing. Owen picked up his tool bag. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. Isla slipped her hand into his as they walked toward the service exit, her paperback tucked under her other arm. The corridor was plain and fluorescent after the orchid-hung ballroom, and their footsteps echoed on the tile. At the door, Isla looked up at him. "Did we get the job?" she asked. "We got the job," he said. She pushed open the door into the cold January air, and he followed her out into it. And behind them the heavy door swung shut on the sound of the gala carrying on without them. The drive back to Sudbury was 4 hours. Isla fell asleep before they reached the 400. Owen drove through the dark with the radio low, the heater running, and the particular quiet that settles over a person when the work is done, and it was done right. And there is no reason to talk about it, and the road just goes on ahead into the dark, and that is enough.